Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Lauren Williams, and we are here tonight for a discussion with Daren Dean, author of The Black Harvest, a novel of the Civil War, and Columbia Daily Tribune's arts editor, Aarik Danielsen. Like I said, my name is Lauren. I'm the Adult and Community Services Manager with the Columbia Public Library, which is part of the Daniel Boone Regional Library System. So we are pleased to have with us this evening author Daren Dean. Daren is the author of the novel Far Beyond the Pale and the short story collection I'll Still Be Here Long After You're Gone. We're here to talk about his third book, Black Harvest, a novel of the American Civil War. His fourth book, The Veil of Tears, is forthcoming this fall. His fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and interviews have appeared in Louisiana Literature, Bull, which is men's fiction, Maryland Literary Review, the Chattahoochee Review, Ecotone, Image, Midwestern Gothic, the Green Hills Literary Lantern, the Oklahoma Review, Plowshares Online, the Huffington Post, and others. In addition, he was recently nominated for 2 Pushcart Prizes in short fiction. Congratulations, Daren. And he holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. And currently, he is an assistant professor of English at Lincoln University of Missouri. I also have to add that he is a former Daniel Boone Regional Library employee. He worked for us back in the 90s, so we're welcoming him back this evening. In conversation with Daren tonight is Aarik Danielsen. Aarik is a Midwestern journalist, essayist, and poet whose writing exists at the four corners of literature, human dignity, pop culture, and theology. Aarik has covered the arts for more than a decade at the Columbia Daily Tribune, and he writes a weekly column called The Discontent, Wednesdays at Fathom Magazine. His bylines have appeared at Image Journal, Plow, Split Lip, Rain Taxi, Entropy, Think Christian, Christ and Pop Culture, Sojourners, Mockingbird, Eco-Theo Review, Relief Journal, The New Territory, and more. He also teaches at his alma mater, the University of Missouri, and he's also a very huge fan and supporter of the library, so we appreciate him being here. Welcome to you both. I'll turn things over to Daren.
All right. Well, thanks, Lauren. I really appreciate you making this all happen. And Aarik, I think I've known Aarik now for about 10 years or so. So I'm glad to have the company here instead of just talking into the void. And I appreciate everyone that's signed up and that's joined us this evening. You know, before we get too far into talking about the Black Harvest, I wanted to show you something that I thought would be kind of fun. And that's the book trailer for the Black Harvest that was created. And it has some images and things in it that really capture things I wanted to do in the book. And it was actually a lot of fun working with the person that created it. And so let me just show that real quick. Let me see if I can share my screen and not fumble around too much here. And there we go. All right, so that's the trailer. Let me see if I can stop my share and get us back. There we go. Hey, pretty smooth, not bad, right? Well, the Black Harvest. First of all, let me just say what it's about. Uh, this is the hardest question you can ask a writer. What's your book about? Flannery O'Connor once said, "You can't really answer that question as a writer. That's why I wrote the book. You're supposed to read the book, right?" But it's a fair question. What's it about? And so, I guess to get right to the heart of it, I would say it's about this young man, this teenager, Ashby Marchbanks. He picks up the nickname Preacher.
Daren, I'm sorry to interrupt. Your volume has got really muffled. If you can be a little closer after the video, it got quiet.
Oh, right. Sorry. Well, his father's a preacher, Ashby, and their farm gets attacked by some jayhawkers, and he his father ends up getting hung or hanged, as they say, right? And he his father wanted him to go into the ministry like him. He had an older brother who's been running around with these bushwhackers here in Missouri, and of course he thinks how great it would be to be with his older brother, and back then, early on in the Civil War, the idea was a lot of people thought it was going to be over so quickly, and they wanted to get in there. A lot of young men wanted to get in there and get their 15 minutes of fame, as we say today, their glory. Tell it over so quickly. No one knew how bloody and how long the war would last. So really, it to me, it's not just about the Civil War. It's really about the Civil War in Missouri. I was so uh, I guess the more I found out about it and realized how little it looked like the Civil War in the East and the big battles we studied about, how different it was here. In a lot of ways, the Black Harvest is a Western. That's how I see it. St. Louis is the gateway to the West, as we all know here in Missouri. And this is where people, after the war, even, it was very unsafe. So this is when people started carrying pistols on their person and things like this. This is the beginning of the West, the Western, what we know as the Western way of life. So I say all that to say I didn't put that very succinctly, right? But it's about the Civil War in Missouri and how violent it was, right? And I even have an epigraph at the beginning of the book from the Iliad, uh, and it says, "I wish that strife would vanish away from among gods, mortals, and Gaul, which makes a man grow angry for all his great mind, that gall of anger that swarms like smoke inside of a man's heart and becomes a thing sweeter to him by far than the dripping of honey." Uh, so this is essentially what the Civil War novel is about. It's the Civil War in Missouri, and a lot of states saw themselves as countries. They thought of themselves as independent from the rest of the country, and this is, in a nutshell, what I think the theme of the Civil War is. After the Civil War is when we really saw ourselves as the United States of America. And I'm no historian as far as that goes. I'm a novelist, but I'm trying to tell the story within that context. And Aarik and I had talked about this a couple of months ago. We met downtown in the coffee shop, and we're kind of talking about a lot of different things. And I know, and I'm glad Aarik joined me because here tonight, because I know he had some insights into this idea of violence and what it means, maybe in fiction or even in the world today. Uh, so you had a question, I think or some questions you wanted to ask her.
Yeah, well, maybe briefly before we get into kind of the heart of violence, as it were, I know you probably, and we don't probably have the time tonight to really break down all of the research that you did. We could probably spend the entire hour talking about that. But I am kind of curious. I'm always really interested when I talk to novelists who write historical fiction about the dance between those two words, between the history and the fiction. And so I wonder if you could just talk for a minute about just what you were looking for in your research. What did you want to find? And maybe, were there any things that you wanted not to know? Things where maybe, having too tight a grip on reality might kind of restrict your imagination. I'm just kind of curious how you engaged in that way.
Well, there is a lot to unpack in the questions you're asking me. I had to do a tremendous amount of research just to, I found it really interesting, the subject matter. Back in the 90s, when I was still at the library, I saw all these books coming across the desk. These new Quantrell biographies were coming out about the same time. And I eventually decided not to write a novel about Quantrell. But as I read more and more, I was just trying to learn for the first time, really, what went on here in Missouri during the Civil War. What little I knew went back to the movies. The Long Riders. The old movie with the Keaches playing the James brothers, and David Carradine playing one of the. I think Cole Younger is who he played. He kind of stole the show in that movie. Uh, the Clint Eastwood movie Outlaw Josie Wales. This is what I knew about. This is the whole sum of what I knew about the Civil War in Missouri, which is to say, not much. But what really impressed me back then was every kid about my age that I met, they would tell you they were related to Jesse James, right? And some old men would tell you that too. Oh, Jesse, oh yeah, my grandpa, he told me he taught at the schoolhouse down the road from here. It says he taught there. I'm like, Jesse James did? Yeah, that's right. They tell you these stories, and I just assumed every single one was true, But it left this big impression on me. And then I kind of forgot about it as I got older. And I had my own, I don't know, resentments about growing up. And I had it in my mind at one point that Missouri hated me, and why did our people stop here? Why didn't they keep going, for God's sakes? And then when I started reading other things, but these characters, these people, I realized it wasn't the place that hated them. It was the circumstances maybe that hated them. And so when I was doing the research, I'll tell you the way a writer's mind works is, for me anyway, the way it works is I wasn't trying to, I wanted to be historically accurate. And so a lot of the battles and events, I did use history to say, this is a real, most of the bigger things that happen, that's real. But then you have to imagine, well, what were those people like? And in the research you hear, oh, this guy was like, he had a Scottish accent, and and he was like this. He was a handsome man. He was a tiny man, Archie Clement. He was like 5 feet tall, but he was one of the most vicious bushwhackers in the story and in history, I guess. So oftentimes what I will come across is maybe just a line or a sentence that struck me as really interesting. And then I might make a whole scene by drawing that line or sentence out because there's no more historical documentation. It just happened to be that historical writers. One of the books that I used was Jesse James, The Last Rebel of the Civil War by T.J. Stiles. And T.J. Stiles won a couple of Pulitzers, though not for this book, though he probably deserved one for this one. But and this is where I kind of learned about John N. Edwards, the newspaper man, who was an interesting and complicated person. And I think I've gotten off track here, but but as far as the research goes, it looks a lot like this. You know, there was so many personalities and details to try to get right. That's why it took me so long to do it. And I have a huge amount of respect for anyone that tackles historical writing, you know, novel writing, because the things you can get wrong, well, there's quite a, they don't stop coming at you.
Yeah.
So I think what's important, always what's important is to get right is the characters and the narrative, and when the people are true. You know, if you're a bullet counter, and when you watch a movie and you're counting the bullet, he doesn't have that many bullets in that gun. I can't watch this. You know, I think you're missing the point of fiction, right? Fiction is not nonfiction. And funny enough, since I'm a professor, a lot of students, a lot of people are confused between what fiction and nonfiction. To me, fiction's a work of art. Nonfiction's what happened. Mark Twain once said, "Truth is stranger than fiction. Fiction has to make sense." And you know, that's the problem with violence. Is oftentimes it's very difficult to put it in context and make sense.
Yeah, that's funny that you said all of that, because I definitely, my father, who still is a very avid Western movie fan, was definitely a bullet counter. And I was not. I was the you know, the viewer, the reader that was like, I just want to feel the soul of the story. I don't really need to know if he's got 4 left or 3 left or what's going on. But it's interesting how people draw those distinctions, and we all kind of gravitate. It seems like one direction or another. But
yeah, my dad is much the same way, and he loves westerns. And he's told me before, I only like stories that are true, right?
yeah.
Well, with historical fiction, you get a little bit of both, right? Hopefully. I just represented myself with this gorenography thing. I you know, since I teach at a college, I thought, oh, I've got to maybe I should make it sound academic and impressive and deflect from the fact that I don't want to talk that much about research. Right? So I was like, I'll get it. It's gorenography. That sounds like something you'd see at an AWP seminar workshop, you know.
Right. Yeah.
But gorenography is just this idea, you know, in film, when they show violence for violence sake and they're trying to horrify you, and there's an audience for that, and some people are like, yes, right? And to me, I guess the difference is, I think, you know, fiction is created because of conflict, right? Uh, and if there's not conflict in a story, it quickly becomes rather dull, right? It doesn't have to be violence, but conflict of some kind. And I came across this. I thought it was interesting. This is a quote from D.H. Lawrence. The essential insult is hard, isolate, stoic, and a killer. It has never yet melted. Um, Now, do I think all of America is like that? Is that what he was saying? I don't think that's what he's saying, but there is this vision that some Americans have of themselves as, I'm tough. And there's a kind of a revenge narrative, right? We see that all the time in movies. And it's in this book too, in my book a little bit too, where some group does violence to another group, and then the rest of the film is about revenge, right? And then they get the revenge, and we say, yes, that's exactly what I would have done, right? And right. But real violence and conflict is oftentimes much more complex than that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, that's something that I thought a lot about as I've been reading the book. And, you know, whether it's the epigraph that you shared earlier or the quote that you just read, this idea of conflict just keeps coming back to me more so than violence or battle or, you know, whatever other noun you want to use. And I don't know, that quote from in the epigraph really hits at that idea of like violence kind of starting inside of us. We think of violence as this external reality, but violence kind of beginning in the soul. I wonder for you, like we haven't really talked about this, and I would be curious to hear you talk about like how you thought about that, like how what's going on inside the character, maybe inside of Ashby, ends up affecting that external reality, ends up potentially ending in violence or, you know, pulling back from violence. I'm really fascinated by that push and pull of, you know, hatred or lust or desire or something happening on the inside, and then at some point it spills over into this actual like physical conflict.
Well, in Ashby, I wanted a character who was deeply conflicted, not some revolutionary visionist who said, this must be done and it must be done this way, and we'll kill them all and let God sort them out. I didn't want to, that's why I didn't write about, you know, originally I thought Quantrell would be the subject. All these, you know, back in the 90s, I thought one day I'm going to write this novel and it's going to be about Quantrell, you know. But just for these reasons, I just didn't feel like he was the right person to write about unless you wrote about him in the sense of like a Cormac McCarthy, where the story is completely objective, right? In the way it's told, not in first person, like my book, but the way Cormac McCarthy tells the story, or sometimes Faulkner, where it's an objective story. All these things happen. It's like the book of Genesis, right? Where there's very little commentary in the stories. You know, like, why was it wrong for the sun to cover Noah's nakedness? Why was that wrong? You know, well, you have to go to Sunday school so they can tell you the answer. But when you look in the text itself, there's no, I don't know, I can't logically figure out why that was bad. And a lot of the stories in Genesis are like that. There's no commentary by the writer telling you what to think or moralize the story for you. And this is a feature of literary fiction. Most of the time, it does not moralize the story. In my book, Ashby is kind of I hate to characterize him this way, but just to be funny, I will. But he's sort of a Civil War era Woody Allen. You know, he's like, I want to be this good person, but I also, you know, I want to follow God, but I also think these people probably maybe they need to be killed or something needs to be done, and I'll have to fight, right? And however that may sound to the modern ear, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, this, unless you're some sort of saint, these are the the darker angels of our nature are always there, right? And to not acknowledge those, you know, this is what we see all the time online. Someone makes some comment that's probably not meant to be taken very seriously, and then someone retweets it or something, and then they say, "Oh, well, when you say this, then you're saying you hate everything," and right? And then everyone's commenting on it, and suddenly there are thousands of whatever it is, it becomes conflated. And I think one reason why we're seeing that, it's not always to have justice. It's not always a noble impulse, is it? Sometimes the reason that's done is to deflect the attention away from self and onto other people. You're the wrongdoer. You're the wrongdoer. You're the wrongdoer, right? When really, heck, I mean, my great uncle was a non-denominational minister, all right? And I remember quite well the scriptures, you know, that say, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that's exactly where Ashby is. And the men he's fighting with, the boys, most of them are teenagers, they start calling him preacher. And a number of times he says, "Don't call me that. I'm Ashby," or, you know, And then there's one of the men is like, "Bless my guns, Father, bless my guns," right? He's like, "Oh, okay, I will," but, and then the next thing you know, he's in a battle, and he's no different, no better in the moment. He shoots his fair number of people. He doesn't commit the atrocities some of the men he rides with commit, like scalping and others I won't mention. But I wanted a character that was deeply conflicted, just like the war had torn the country apart. The state was torn apart here in Missouri and everywhere else. And I wanted a character that reflected that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I've responded to most in the book, and I was just even thinking about this today of, you know, I think maybe we can talk more about this as we go, but kind of this debate that people have with violence, whether it be in fiction or film or wherever else, that, is it realistic, or are you glorifying this, or what's going on? And one of the things I appreciate in Black Harvest is you almost always wrestle with the aftermath of some violent act. And by aftermath, yes, maybe more violence, but what I mean by that is, Ashby does something and then he's immediately regretful, or he immediately feels some sort of kind of terror inside of him about what's happened. And to me, that's a way to, go around or not actually glorify the act that's happened, is to show that, like, there are people that are left over after this thing has happened, and they're having to wrestle with what they've just done. I don't know if you want to say more about that, but I just really appreciate that, because you never see bravado in Ashby, really, maybe for a moment, but it's quickly gone. He deals with guilt, he deals with second guessing himself, all of those things. And I think that, I don't know that I would say it softens the violence. I would say in some ways it draws it into clearer relief, because we actually have to sit with the reality of what just took place.
Yeah, he's quick to anger, but he's also quick to question himself, and I would think anyone in that situation, uh, I think, who was it? I think it might have been Oscar Wilde when he came to America. He one of the things he said right off the bat was, "I have nothing to declare except myself." But another thing he said was, "Everything common to man is common to me."
Hmm.
Right. And that, I think, the job of the novelist, one of the things the novelist does that's difficult to do in fiction, is you have to be willing to be so honest on the page in a way that you can't be person to person.
Hmm.
That's why when you find a book that you love and you love it so much, it's because you actually have come to know some of those characters probably better than you'll ever know another person, right? I mean, if you think to friends and family and different people, and you think, why, I'm not talking about my father, but, I know someone might say, well, why was my father this way? Why was my mother this way? Why couldn't they talk to me? Why couldn't they tell me, explain something? Why did it always just turn into a yelling match, or uh, egos clashing, or something like this? Oftentimes we don't know people's motivations, but this is one of the things I love about fiction, is you can find out the motivations, especially in a first person narrative, like this one. You'll hear some of the motivations in an intimate way that you can almost never know in real life.
Yeah.
And so this is something, it took me a long time to get it to the point where I thought it was at least as right uh, as it is. One thing I wanted to mention too, when it comes to TV shows and movies and that kind of influences, my mom actually told me years ago, she said, "I watch The Walking Dead and I really like that show, Walking Dead." And I of zombie shows I had seen, and I thought, that is the dumbest thing. I'm like, "Listen, Mom, I'm not watching that show. That show's idiotic. But then I did start watching it, and most of the time, the zombies to me are the most boring part of that show. That's Goronnography, right? Even my son was watching it with me once, and he said, "It looks like they're out of the Thriller video." And I was like, "Yeah, it is kind of cheesy at times, like that, campy almost." Uh, but when the show is interesting, and it's not every episode actually, is when the characters are either given a moral choice or they have to make a moral choice.
Yeah.
Right. And in that show, and in a book of similarity, if you have to make a moral choice, and either choice is going to result in consequences, now you probably have the reader by the neck. They're like, "Oh my God, I got to make this choice." And no matter what they choose, it's a bad outcome. Right. So to me, that's the moral element of something that maybe seems to be without moral content, but in those moments where there's a choice to be made, right? That's when it gets interesting.
Yeah, well, I hate to go back to this, and kind of say whatever we're saying about our respective fathers, but the idea of the bullet counter, right, in the TV show or in the book, I think what's so interesting about that is saying, well, I want this story to be true, but so often what those stories leave out is what you're just talking about. We don't get to see or wrestle with that moral choice alongside the character, and to me, that wrestling is far more about truth than whether they got the bullets right. You know what I'm saying? Like, to me, that feels like the part that feels really true to me. And so that's why I appreciate that you do dig so hard into the conflict with Ashby, because it feels like that's truer to me. That's the detail that I want to be accurate, even above anything else,
Right. I think there's an element of persuasion to this. When I teach composition to students, I don't know how many students I've talked to, and in their minds, when they say they write a paper, some kind of position paper, in their minds, if they present enough facts, that makes the argument. Here's the fact. Well, we can see over the last, I don't know how many years now, in politics, facts, if you can't agree upon the facts, they prove nothing. They don't persuade anyone of anything. And if I don't like the facts, I can just discredit where the facts came from, right? And then they mean nothing. So it's there's another thing Mark Twain said that I always share with students when I point this out to them, the problem with only presenting facts, and say, because I want to say, well, where's the author in this? Where do you stand on this? Not just what do the facts say, right? Twain said, there's three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, that to me, it's more important to get the human element right. Although I did want to get facts about the war right, and that's another interesting problem, a conundrum. When you do research about something, it's not as well documented as you think. It is and it isn't, right? You really have to dig. And so one of the methods of warfare the Bushwhackers had was they didn't use as many rifles. They used pistols, because what they like to do is bushwhack people. That's where they got that. When I was a kid, the only time I heard the word bushwhacker was like in old cartoons, like Looney Tune cartoons, and they'd say, "He's a bushwhacker." And I'm like, what's a bushwhacker anyway? Well, that's where it came from. That's what a bushwhacker does, right? He hides and he waits, and finds a way to get the drop on you. And so they like to come in on their horses, sometimes dressed in blue, and surprise the Missouri militia, the home guard, or the federal troops. And hey, boys, oh, look, it's us. And then they ride up and they pull their pistols out, shoot at close range, and ride away. They're not trying to capture a flag, right? It's guerrilla warfare. They ride off. So this was their method of fighting, which is always effective, in various wars, is kind of guerrilla warfare style fighting, where this was how they were fighting, not with let's stand like they were in the East, let's stand there and line up and shoot at each other, and oh, we captured this hill, and then as soon as the battle's over, what good is that hill? Nothing. They leave, right? So if you died sometimes, or family member died, oh, we wanted to capture that hill, we captured it, and then they died, right? Capturing that hill that they left the next day,
Yeah.
But I think some of these bushwhackers were, it's complicated because there's an area from Blue Springs in the west all the way up to probably Callaway County that kind of follows along the Missouri River, where most of the slaveholding population in this state were, right? I went to high school in Mexico, Missouri. I'm pointing over there, but there, I don't know. And the newspaper, the Mexico Ledger, they used to have in their byline, the home of the Little Dixie, or something like that, the Little Dixie. And I'm not sure technically if they were actually part of the Little Dixie, but it's interesting. A little snippet associated with the newspaper, right?
Sure.
And then down in, do you say New Madrid or New Madrid, or down south? That was another area that had a high slave population. But since we're a border state, the Missouri Compromise came along around 1820, and it admitted, I think, Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. And that's when they started trying to keep it even between slave and free states. But then about, was it 1854, 1852, 1854, we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? And with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the federal government essentially said, we wash our hands of this problem. We're not going to regulate, slave free, as new territories become states. So with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this is in the 1850s, long before the Civil War started with Fort Sumter, they said the population would decide. They called it popular sovereignty, right? And so it sounded like a great idea. Let the people decide, the government, let the people decide. That solves that problem. Stephen Douglas, the politician that had all the debates with Abraham Lincoln, he was one of the big voices for popular sovereignty at that time. But what it resulted in was a lot of violence, a lot of abolitionists, and a lot of people who are pro-slavery suddenly started artificially, sending people to those territories in Missouri and Kansas, and this is when the violence really started in our state. It was way before the Civil War, but this is what lit the fuse to the Civil War.
Yeah.
And that's what I found in terms of my research that I guess was important to know.
Yeah. I want to clarify to you earlier, as the one working journalist on this panel, that I do care about accuracy and facts and truth.
Yeah.
But no, I so appreciate it, and I think, and maybe I'll draw some ties here to some of your other work too, because I've read a lot of your work where, I do think that that's the truth as the reader of a novel that I want to sit with, is the truth of what happens to someone either as or after they're committing an act of violence, right? Like what is the rot or the desperation or whatever that is? I mean, that feels truer on a level that we rarely get at. And I think, I mean, you really do a good job in your other work too, the stuff that's contemporary, talking about that. I wonder, like for you, I'm curious, like I feel like we've never talked about this, but like if it felt different writing, I mean, obviously the acts themselves were different and the frequency of the acts were different, but if it felt different to you writing, you know, maybe some of the violent scenes in Black Harvest versus some of the ones that were in, you know, some of your other work, because, you know, it seems like in the short stories or in some of the other novels, you know, there might be one or two, you know, really precipitating acts, and, you know, we've got kind of got this tension going throughout. You know, in this book, there's a lot more, you know, that thread is almost on every page that something could happen. But I just wonder, does that feel different to you to write kind of violence in a historical sense, I guess, versus in a more contemporaneous sense?
Well, it doesn't feel different. Once I got my head into the world of the historical world, I don't know. I think some people maybe feel this more than others, but the subject matter in the stories, the more I found out about them, I've always been interested in different eras in history. But I guess because I had been to so many of the places here in Missouri, and then when I read about them and the people, I realized these people are us, and it's almost like a ancestral memory, or I just felt a real something something inside me lined up with it the more that I read about it.
Yeah.
And, and so I won't say it was like I was there, but obviously I could imagine being in the middle of these things. There's a place out in Western Missouri, and you'll see the courthouse with the cannonball lodged in the pillar. You know, go to these different historical areas, and some towns, you know, that have buildings and streets that were pretty either of that era or pretty close, and you get an echo of that place, or I do. I feel this echo sometimes, uh, and so I guess it's kind of a deep well of empathy that kind of springs up. You know, reminds me of something Ray Bradbury, you know, writer who wrote the Martian Chronicles and Fahrenheit 451. He said, you know, he talked about how when he was a boy, the subjects that interested him were the things he ended up writing about when he was in his 30s and 40s as a more mature person. And those are the books that we know now. But the fuse was lit when he was a child, and so I kind of feel I understand what he means when he talks about that, right? I remember this one story he told where he said he went to the fair or the carnival, and the man had a sword in his hand. He's probably a carnival barker, you know, trying to get people to buy tickets. And he said he put the sword on the edge of his nose when he was a little, you know, he's like 7 years old, 6 years old. He put it on the edge of his nose and he said, "Live forever, live forever, live forever." And then he said, "I wanted to go back the next day," right? Then obviously he didn't live forever, but you notice when people talk about dying, they'll always say, "Well, if I die,
Mm.
if I die." Even though there's all this evidence to the contrary, it's not if, it's when I die. But we don't say, we're maybe too fearful to say that. We say, if I die, da 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 da, right? Uh, well, I think history or historical novels too, that's a way of living longer. You know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think there's something to kind of what you were saying earlier too about just like getting in the world of that time. You know, this is a weird comparison to make, but I've been thinking about it for the last couple of days, so I guess I might as well say it. Which is that, you know, I was thinking about how kind of in this question of like how people depict realistic violence. I was thinking about growing up in the '90s and, you know, being a white kid in small town Arizona, but listening to hip hop that was being made, you know, by young Black men in Southern California. And there was always this question of like, well, are these artists glorifying these acts that they're talking about in these lyrics? And to a man, you would ask these artists, and they would say, well, we're just telling you what's going on every day outside our front door. And I think that's what's, I think there's an interesting kind of analog to what you're doing in Black Harvest, which is that, you're not, I don't think, unless you unless you want to contradict me, you're not trying to add more violence to the world of that time. You're just trying to say, hey, this is what it would have been like if you were riding with these bushwhackers. This is what every day was going to be like for you. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, is that when the writer or the musician or whoever, the filmmaker, gets in the headspace of the people that would have been there, those acts become, realistic in and of themselves, because they're trying to wrestle with that time and place. I don't know. I just think there's something really important to think about with that.
Oh, definitely. I think in any act, especially a bad act, there's always moral content there.
Yeah.
There always is. It's political, it's moral, it's all of these things. At the same time, I try to remind myself that even, I was born in the 60s and came of age in the 70s and 80s. And that time, even then, was it's not ancient days,
Right.
but it's very different than today. Very different. The expectations for a man are very different, right? I can remember growing up, someone might say to you, oh, make you mad, upset you. And then if you weren't willing to fight them over it or fight someone, they would say, what's wrong with you? What are you? Are you a sissy? Are you gay? What's wrong with you? Well, why are you crying about this?
Hmm.
Be a man. I'm like, be a man. I'm 9 years old. What are you talking about being a man? They teach you how to fight, slap you around a little bit, right? Here's how you throw a punch, right? If you caught these kinds of things happening, someone made a video and showed a father teaching his son how to fight. Can you imagine the storm that would result from that? I just heard about a video where it showed a woman filming her husband picking up their 23-year-old nanny and grooming her. He's grooming her for the future, right? This is a horrible video that these people have created. Well, this is what I imagine would happen if they show. So I'm just saying, is the concerns that we have in 2021 are not the same as 30 years ago, as 50 years ago, and 100 years ago. I'll tell you what amazes me is another thing I thought about writing about, but I realized I didn't know if I had another 20 some years to write it, was I also read a lot of abolitionists during the Civil War. And what amazed me about them was how committed they were to, whether they were Black or white, to equality, to the ideas in our Constitution, equality names, and I thought, that undercuts what I just said 2 minutes ago, right? The whole argument there is they lived in that time, and they were someone like a John Brown was committed to doing violence in order to make that happen, right? And others, for that matter, some were nonviolent, some. And we had Beecher's Bibles being sent, to Kansas and Missouri, right? Rifles to make the abolitionist point. So I had thought about that too, thought about making one of those, either a character in the book or have their own book. But then I thought, well, if I have another 20 years of research, I'm not sure I can get that done. But I think there is definitely moral content, but I think it's very, the time we live in right now is very confused time. There are kind of mental battle lines that have been drawn, right? And when people look back at the Civil War, I think there's this notion. Some folks want to idealize the past and say, "Oh, things were so much simpler then. That's when we had family values." Well, read The Black Harvest and then tell me about the family values.
Right.
And the politics of that time were, I would argue, were probably more complex than the politics of our time.
Yeah.
Our politics, in a sense, are not that complex because it's so left versus right. There's not a party of moderate anyone anymore. And if you try to present yourself as a moderate, you're going to either be ignored or lambasted for not picking a side, right? But during that time, they had, I don't know, 4 or 5 political parties even, and one would die and another one would spring up and another one would die. And the Republican Party came out of the old Whig Party and during the Civil War. Lincoln, Stephen Douglas's and Lincoln's party, right? So I'm just trying to say that violence in the book, it's like Madison Smart Bell. He was nice enough to blurb my novel for me. And when he blurbed it, he says, "It's happening all around the world right now. And right now, in the spring of 2021, we have even seen a few preliminary skirmishes here in the United States." Dean's account of guerrilla fighting Civil War era shows how very, very bad it can get.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to make a single statement and say that explains it all.
Right. Yeah.
We've got just a few more minutes. I want to thank you all for that conversation. I want to bring in the question we've got from the chat. Someone asks, in what ways does your novel say something new about the Civil War, or does it have to?
Oh, well, as far as saying something, I don't know, like philosophical or something, commentary on it, I think that's the difference between a novel and, say, an essay. An essay or a piece in the newspaper, an op-ed or something, does that probably better than fiction does it. To me, it was simply about telling a story that I wanted to, to be like some of my literary forefathers, the Cold Mountains, Blood Meridian, Woe to Live On by Daniel Woodrell. I just wanted to add my voice and not necessarily say, I'm going to give you new insight into the Civil War. Maybe Ashby's point of view can do that as a character better than I can do it as an author talking about it.
I don't know if this is more of a comment than a question, that something that you wrote towards the beginning, you're talking about violence, especially, and pointing out how young a lot of these men were. A lot of them were just really boys, lying about their age to sign up and that sort of thing. And you write, you take a 19-year-old and train him to fight, and you will never find a more cruel soldier under the right circumstances. And I just found that chilling. And I think about, youth getting radicalized now, or how their brains are still developing when they're in their teens, and how easy, maybe the wrong word, but it can be for a young person to fall into violence.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, during this time in the Civil War, even the captains of the Bushwhackers, a lot of them were 24, 25. I think Clontrell was the old man at 27, or something around that time. He was the old man. So most just boys, because all the men were married, they were farming, trying to make a living, or they were fighting in the East. So they were doing one or the two, officially fighting, right? You know, at one point, Quantrell goes to Jefferson, Secretary of War for Jefferson Davis, and tries to get him to give him a commission in the Confederate Army and make him a colonel. Well, they wouldn't do it. And so he came back, but before he came back to Missouri, he bought a colonel's uniform, Confederate uniform, put it on, and then he said, yep, I'm a colonel now. But really, they didn't want to be associated. It's just like the military really today, right? When do they want you? They really ideally want you when you're 18. You're malleable then.
It's a good word. Another question about what surprised you the most researching and writing this book? What surprised you?
Well, I don't know what surprised me the most, but I'm surprised by a great things. And the thing that I was surprised the most, guess, might be just individual stories sometimes, the feats that people direct that seemed superhuman. And I'll give you one quick example of it. At the Battle of Centralia, there was a soldier that was on this train. The Bushwhackers stopped it. They get off. They separated the non-combatants from some of the soldiers who were on. The soldiers, they said, get out on this side of the train. They made them disrobe, and they were just going to execute them right there. The Bushwhackers were. And they were unarmed because someone had the great idea. I can just see it now. Someone had the great idea. They said, well, there's no problem. It'll be fine. We'll put all the rifles and the pistols in this one train under guard. Well, so then what happens when the train gets stopped? No one's armed. Very few people were armed. There were a few. And this just sounds like something administration, the administrative body would decide it was a great idea. And everyone's like, this is a terrible idea. There's a war going on. But there was a man, one of the men, he's this giant man. I think his name was Valentine Peterson was his name. And he's a big man, and he decided, if this is how I'm going to die, he just went at the Bushwhackers unarmed and tried to fight them and get away and fight them. They shot him 20 times, and he still kept fighting them. And Bloody Bill Anderson said, if I just had 20 men like that, I could take the state of Missouri. I wouldn't even need Sterling Price, and I could just take it myself if I had 20 men like that. And so there were a lot of the thing that surprised me were so many stories like that I'd never heard before that just seemed like superhuman feats that people performed, and it was verified by many people that's what happened. And it goes back to truth is stranger in fiction. Fiction has to make sense. If you presented that in fiction, you have to be careful how you do it, because the person reading it's going to say that's not real. Yeah. And just like all beginning writers say in fiction classes, that was the only real part of the story. It's always the part that doesn't seem real.
Well, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to share with our folks viewing at home?
Well, let me go to my notes here. I'll have a closing thought for you.
Okay.
Well, I go back to, I remember teaching at LSU when I'd only been teaching there a couple of years, and this idea of trigger warnings was suddenly came across the board, and I was like, trigger warning? What's a trigger warning? And then they explained it to me. And then, so the idea was, in your classes, you've got to do something with a trigger warning. I'm like, what? Because I'm teaching grit lit. And so I don't know if this is irresponsible or just the truth, but I said, listen, I'm teaching grit lit. Here's your trigger warning. We're going to read about unrequited love. We're going to read about religious zealots. We're going to read about murder. all chicken fighting. We're read about all these things, just like Shakespeare, right? Think about Hamlet. How does Hamlet end? You know, we've got sword fighting, poisoning, patricide, murder. We got all these things lined up in it, and a lot of it happens at the very end of the play, and people think, oh yes, Shakespeare, he's so elevated. His language was elevated, but the plot was like noir of the time. So that's what I would say about, you know, when it comes to reading violence, is it's really common to us. I just didn't want it. My big fear with the novel was that it would be glorifying it, when really I wanted to tell a story that had emotional truth to it.
And can you remind us once again how we could get a copy of your book?
Well, it's the best way to get it is through the publisher, which is the University of West Alabama at Livingston Press. He gives the best deal. If you want a hardback or a paperback, you can get it through Amazon, or you can go to your local bookseller and ask them to order it for you, and they should be able to order it. Excellent.
Well, I want to thank, on behalf of the library, I want to thank you for sharing your time and this really interesting discussion with us this evening. And I want to thank all of our attendees as well. If you want to check out recordings of past events, and like I said, this event will be there shortly. Put the website in the chat once more. This program will be on the library's YouTube channel and linked from that events page. Aarik, thank you so much. Daren, thank you for being with us this evening. And I've really enjoyed your conversation. And thanks everyone for attending. Have a good rest of your night.
Thanks everyone.